Big Interview
with Bongani Bingwa.
The other issue, of course, is how much is too much. We're now looking at executive pay for state-owned enterprises. It comes from a question that was asked by DA MP Leah Potgieter about what exactly are we paying the executives in state-owned enterprises? Her particular objection also relates to how many of them are failing in their core mandates. So do these executives deserve their millions? And let me go through some of them. For example, the CEO of the Development Bank of South Africa earns a cool 15.5 million rand. That's 42,000 rand a day. We should have those till sounds kg, hey? The Transnet CEO earns 8.5 million rand. That works out to 708,000 rand every month, or 23,000 rand a day. PRASA, 7.8 million. The Road Accident Fund, 7.1 million, and so on and so forth. Leah Potgieter has very graciously joined us in the studio this morning. Welcome to 702 Breakfast.
Thanks, Bongani, and good morning to your listeners.
So what's your objection with these salaries?
Well, initially I asked the question because there's no clear information on the state-owned entities. There's no standardized, framework that they operate from in determining how these executives are paid. And I wanted to basically understand it before I started, delving into it. And actually, it's quite interesting you mentioned the DBSA. That's actually a 50% increase on their salary from the last financial year. The previous salary of the DBSA CEO was 10.5 million, and it got a lovely 47% increase.
Gosh, I'm talking to my bosses now. See, that is possible. That is possible, bosses. But in a more serious note, how is it determined which CEO earns how much? In other words, shouldn't there be a kind of standard that if you are the leader of a state-owned entity, this is more or less the band rather, in which you get paid?
You would think so, but no. And this is really what I'm looking at, is how to standardize. And it was interesting, once I started asking these questions, the Minister of Finance actually came out and said he's going to start looking at standardizing the frameworks across the board. They all use different frameworks. Eskom, for example, says that they benchmark on JSE-listed companies, which is great, but Eskom is not a JSE-listed company, and it certainly doesn't turn a profit. People aren't worried about what, for example, the CEO of Capitec earns, because he brings in the rewards. They have capitalized on the market that they've, looked at, and he's bringing in what the company needs to operate. They're turning a profit. It seems to me that the worse these entities are doing, the higher the salaries are going. And if you look at across the board, they're awarding performance bonuses in cases where they actually haven't performed, which doesn't make any sense. They're even awarding performance bonuses to acting CEOs, which shouldn't happen because they're not contracted in that particular position.
But are we comparing apples with oranges? If I think of some of the private sector CEOs, Old Mutual, for example, rakes in 32 million rand. ShopRite, Peter Engelbrecht getting as much as 83 million rand. I can go on about Investec and BHP Billiton and Naspers and Discovery. These are executives who earn far higher with all kinds of things like share options, for example. So their value in terms of remuneration isn't just what goes into their bank accounts. There's so much more. When you compare that with the executives of state-owned entities, it's much more significant.
100%. But the difference between those companies and the state-owned entities where the highest salaries are being paid is that they are not performing. The companies where CEOs earn that kind of money, and nobody is disgruntled over that fact, because they bring in more money, which means they can hire more people and they can do more.
But on the other hand, the impact of SOEs on this economy is, in some sense, is even more significant, because if the lights are off, as we know, none of those private sector CEOs can rake in the profits that you speak of so admiringly. I mean, some would say, after all those years of load shedding, pay Dan Morakane all he wants to keep the lights on.
I agree with you. Look, I think if CEOs are performing, nobody really cares what they earn. I think it's important, though, to have a framework and a benchmark. What seems to be happening is when an SOE starts failing, they start digressing from the standard operating rules or the regulations around, HR procedures in order to, bring in more qualified people. but it seems to be not doing any service to the SOEs. They're just looking at the salary, upping it. I mean, you look at the DBSA, we're upping it by 50%, and Eskom was the same. And they're not looking at the failures within the state-owned entities and fixing those.
But how you attract some of those executives to deal with those failures? Many executives, now the incumbents, essentially didn't cause some of those problems. They've been hired at these amounts to try and fix those problems.
Look, I don't have any issue with trying to attract the best talents in the country. That's what you want. You want these people operating your SOEs. But what you also want is for Parliament to be able to understand what frameworks are you using. It cannot be that because you don't like the framework or because you don't like the benchmarks. I mean, in some of the responses I got, they can't even tell me what benchmarking they're using. And that's simply what I'm trying to understand, is what is the standard practice that you're utilizing so that we can understand how you're hiring people. Is it the best practice for the SOE? But if you can't even tell me how you're doing it, then how must we understand exactly how your SOE is operating?
Gosh, the Road Accident Fund, technically insolvent, but executives earning over 7 million rand?
Well, it's interesting.
How do we swallow that?
It's interesting because some of the SOEs that are performing, quite well actually have the lowest salaries. So they definitely, for me, on this initial, and I mean, I haven't even received all the responses back. I've actually gone on a different tangent as well to look at KPIs and how they're measuring performance. So this can all be kind of put in together because it's not just about salaries. And some of these, the best performing SOEs, their CEOs are earning the lowest out of the entire, lots of them. So it speaks to the fact that salary alone is not an indication of how somebody's going to perform.
What does that say about the various boards of these state-owned entities and whatever oversight committees may be responsible for all of this?
Well, I think we've seen issues with boards over the years. I mean, you've seen a lot of the ministers. I know Dean McPherson, for example, and Solly Malatsi have also reconfigured their boards in their various ministries. But I do think that there needs to be stronger oversight mechanisms within there. I've got a colleague actually within the DA who's looking at that particular issue.
Leah Potgieter, appreciate your time popping into the studio, raising concerns around executive pay for state-owned entities. How do you dice it? I'd love to hear your calls on 011 883 0702. We'll take your WhatsApp voice notes on 072 702 1702. To get the best out of these entities, don't you need to attract the very best talent? And shouldn't you therefore remunerate them accordingly? Or do you say, hang on, this is not a spaza shop. There must be some kind of standardized measure to determine what these people get. And partly, if you're working for an SOE, there is a sense of public service, country duty, as it were. Which way do you dice it?
Current events, developing stories,
tough questions.
Your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.